Hello and welcome to this little island amid the ocean that YouTube is. On today's video, I hope to provide you with a quick introductory understanding of the European Union's birth. As of today, May 9th, 2023, the European Union celebrates 73 years of a common goal and dream. Considered as the birthday date of the EU, May 9th marks the anniversary of the historic Schuman Declaration that set out the idea for a new form of political cooperation in Europe, in which the countries shared resources and relied on each other for raw materials, thus becoming less likely to go to war, eventually making war between Europe's nations unthinkable. To define Europe is to question from which perspective we want to look at its concept. Geographically inserted on a continent shared with Asia, the definition of continental Europe is not defined naturally, but rather artificially. The eastern boundary of Europe is conventionally defined as running down the Ural Mountains, across the Caspian Sea, and along the Caucasus Mountains. But these are merely geographical features that have been adopted as a meeting place of Europe and Asia in spite of political reality. The Urals, for example, were nominated as a boundary by an 18th century Russian cartographer, Vasily Tachkiev, simply so that Russia could claim to be an Asian as well as a European power. The birth of Europe has often been dated to the early Middle Ages due to the development of a common civilization surrounding Christianity and Rome as a spiritual capital and Latin as a language of education. As Europe became the aggressor and Christian armies were formed, a tighter identity seemed to develop, but its cultural diversity ensured that unity was restricted to matters of foreign conquest and hostility beyond its borders. Christendom was thus often more used to describe the area than the term Europe itself. If anything, they became interchangeable. The idea of world culture is of European origin, yet, ironically, it is difficult to pinpoint it in Europe, as Europeans have much that unites them, but much more that divides them. They like a common history, they speak many different languages, they have different social values, their views of their place in the world often differ, they have gone to war with each other with tragic regularity, they have often redefined their alliance and their identity, and they have frequently redrawn their eternal frontiers in response to changes in political affiliation. In 1306, the French lawyer and diplomat Pierre de Bois suggested the princes and cities of Europe should form a confederal Christian republic, which would be overseen by a permanent assembly of princes working to ensure peace through the application of Christian principles. To de Bois, in the event of a dispute, a panel of 9 judges would be brought together to arbitrate, with the Pope acting as a court of final appeal. In the 17th century, Duc de Sully proposed a redrawing of administrative lines throughout Europe in order to achieve an equilibrium of power and the creation of a European Senate with 66 members, serving 3-year terms. Influenced by his ideas, William Penn proposed in 1693 the creation of a European Diet or Parliament that could be used on dispute resolutions through a 3/4 majority vote, weighted according to the economic power of the various countries. And in 1717, the Abbé de Saint-Pierre published his 3-volume project for settling an everlasting peace in Europe, in which he argued for free trade and a European Senate. But nationalism led to further rivalries between European states, and whilst intellectuals promoted ideas of unity, political leaders showed little to no interest on them. The combination of rising nationalism and competition for colonial possessions led to the increased militarization that eventually led to the Great War. The horrors of the First World War now created an audience that was much more open to the idea of European integration, and discussions involved not just intellectuals, but political leaders as well. Yet, after the Great War, the prevailing view in France was that a European cooperation was an impossible ideal, and that the best hope for peace was to have a powerful France and a weak Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 between Germany and the victorious Allies, held Germany responsible for starting the war and imposed harsh penalties that included loss of territory, massive reparation payments, and its demilitarization. The treaty humiliated Germany and not only failed to address the issues that had led to the war, but it accentuated economic distress and would fuel Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933. Interested on the idea of Count Richard Kaltenhoff-Kalergi of a pan-European Union, Edouard Herriot would in 1924 call for the creation of a United States of Europe that would grow out of the cooperation promoted by the League of Nations, whilst Aristide Briand would call for a European Confederation within the League of Nations. In May 1930, Briand would distribute to governments a memorandum outlining his ideas, in which he wrote of the need of a permanent regime of solidarity based on international agreements for the rational organization of Europe. He used such terms as common market and European Union, and even listed specific policy needs, such as development of trans-European transport networks, and anticipated what would later become the regional and social policies of the EU. Nonetheless, the rise of Nazi Germany would sweep aside any prospects of discussion. Yet, the war brought more than destruction. It cemented that only peace could bring prosperity, and such was not possible without cooperation. Since 1945, the differences between European countries were slowly replaced by common interests, goals, and values. This desire for a closer cooperation, as we saw before, was not necessarily new, yet it had never been truly explored, since the key difference between then and now is the much wider political and public support for the idea of integration than there ever has been before. On May 5, 1949, the Council of Europe is established, which aims to promote democracy and protect human rights and the rule of law. It was signed by 10 countries: Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Italy, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In subsequent years, other European nations would join, counting now with 46 member states. On May 9, 1950, Schuman proposes a plan which aims for deeper cooperation. Based on this plan, on April 18, 1950, Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg would sign a treaty to run their coal and steel industries under a common management. The European Coal and Steel Community is thus born and comes into being in 1952. With the European Coal and Steel Community success, the 6 founding countries expand their cooperation to other economic sectors. On March 25, 1957, the Treaties of Rome are signed, creating the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community. Thus, the 3 European communities were created. Then, on March 19, 1958, the European Parliamentary Assembly is formed and Robert Schuman elected its president. On March 30, 1962, its name would be changed to what we now know as European Parliament. With the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the European Economic Community would become the European Community. Then, with the Treaty of Lisbon, signed on December 2007, which entered in force on December 1, 2009, the term community is replaced, and the European Union succeeds the European Community. The European Union is built on 3 pillars. The first lies with the European communities which approve regulations. The methodology of decision is based on the majority, however, unanimous decisions can be used for matters of greater impact. The second pillar is the common foreign and security policy, in which votes are carried out unanimously. Finally, the third pillar lies with the police and judicial cooperation in criminal matters. Whilst the first pillar is essentially based on an integration methodology, the second and third pillars are focused on political cooperation, allowing greater room for member states to maneuver. The institutions listed by the Treaty of Lisbon go from 5 to 7, considering the principle of interinstitutional balance. When thinking of the European Union, it is important to think about the principle of speciality or competence by attribution, which determines that the EU cannot act without being bound by what is established in the treaties by the member states at each revision thereof. The EU does not have a generic competence, only the powers delegated to it by the member states. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this small intro video to the EU shed some light on why it was created. If you liked the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. See you next time. Stay safe.